It sets the stage for a more efficient and effective healthcare ecosystem that gets patients what they need faster, that allows symptoms to be controlled and reduce ER visits, hospitalizations, total cost of care, and ends up being better for healthcare professionals.
Welcome to AI in Healthcare, where we discuss all of the things that relate to artificial intelligence, tech, and the future of healthcare as a whole. Love it, hate it, trust it, or don't. One thing is for sure, being familiar with everything that can be leveraged and is already introduced into healthcare today as it relates to AI is important to stay on top of. These episodes will be hosted by two people, myself, Dr. Sanjay Juneja, also known as the Onc Doc on social and news media. I'm a hematologist, medical oncologist, and lately an AI enthusiast. I am joined by Mika Newton, CEO of Xcures, who has long sponsored this podcast as it was previously known as Target Cancer. We aim to make the content in this podcast as digestible and understandable as possible, even if you have no AI or tech background. But if you're excited and interested in healthcare and how it relates to us and personalized therapy and precision therapy, both preventative, anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory, this is the place you want to be. I couldn't be more excited to start off this new juncture and transformation with Dr. Debra Patt, who, in addition to being a good friend and someone I look very much up to, is extremely educated when it comes to not only the evolution of cancer as a whole, but where it's headed. She currently sits as the Executive Vice President of Texas Oncology, and she has been the Medical Director for Public Policy for the U.S. Oncology Network and is currently the President of Community Oncology Alliance, in addition to the fact that she is a board member of ASCO and the chair for the Artificial Intelligence Task Force for ASCO, where she is a liaison for the Clinical Innovation Committee. With all that said, Debra, we're excited to have you.
Thank you, Sanjay. I'm so excited to be here. And, I think that it's been a professional goal of mine to surround myself with smart, talented people that are trying to fix the real problems before us. And I've really valued our collaborative work together because I think that this is a problem that healthcare needs to solve. AI is here. There are many ways that we can use it incredibly well. These are ready for us today, and some will be ready for us in the very near term. And we need to really heighten the awareness of these so organizations can adopt the right solutions and guide and direct their team members to adopt these changes in an appropriate way to improve care delivery the way it really should be delivered.
And let's start there, because a lot of people, not a lot as many as before anyway, let's go ahead and start there, because I still hear some people saying, do you think AI will work out, right? And you and I know that it's already here and used in several capacities. But talk with us if you can, what you see AI doing to help solve problems for physicians, maybe specifically to cancer or outside of it, within the next 6 to 12 months as it relates to patient care and the kind of, taxing or more heavy lifting that's required to practice currently?
It's a great question, Sanjay. So I would say AI is going to be in every part of care delivery. And I think actually where it works best, we're barely even going to perceive that it's there. So if I could just walk you through a journey, everything from reminding patients that they need screening to enhancing screenings, things like CAD enhancements of mammography, things like polyp interpretation and colonoscopy, enhanced reads of CT scans that learn from MRIs that have large language models that enhance their capabilities to understand what they see, reading a biopsy report in pathology, clinical decision support, which I think we'll talk about more, that I think is really critical, and how doctors are offering patients the ability to have access to clinical trials and to think about the complexity of care delivery choices in the therapeutic journey. And then as the therapeutic journey changes, as it often does in cancer care, how we think about that with clinical decision support, how we get the patients the right information that they need for them and their caregivers. So from the care delivery piece, I think that there are so many places. And where I see it today in terms of just outside of the care delivery pieces in drug discovery, so, whether it's designing the right proteins for understanding the folding of proteins and designing drugs, to really think about how you begin clinical trials, or even clinical trial optimization, because clinical trials are very expensive. And you can probably optimize clinical trials so they're powered effectively to give you the result that you need to understand if a therapy is going to be effective by changing certain parameters. And AI is used in all of those spaces today. But to your question more directly, how it impacts physicians in sort of our work burden, because it has become administratively burdensome to be a working doctor. And like Sanjay, I also am a working doctor. So I'm a breast medical oncologist in Austin, Texas, at Texas Oncology. We use AI in the clinic today. So we have, I use an AI scribe. So I have ambient listening as I sit there and talk to patients that allows to a note to be created that about 30 seconds after I finished a visit, a note is scribed to reflect the things that we've talked about in our visit. So that could be anything from a patient understanding their stage, their therapeutic plan, risks and benefits of alternatives of various different treatments. And so by having an AI scribe, not only does it, I call all these pivots the home for dinner campaign, or how do we sort of get doctors home for dinner and not, dictating for 2 hours after a clinic. But not only does it allow me to be more efficient and effective at clinic, but by that note being available to my patient, the very evening that I see them on their patient portal, they're able to discuss their clinical issues with their caregivers and really get a greater understanding of their disease. It may be unique to oncology, but this asymmetry of information exists a lot between doctors and patients. And getting patients real-time information about their disease for them and their caregivers allows them to be better informed about their healthcare journey. And that really facilitates better adoption of treatments and better compliance with treatments. That becomes really important. So I use an AI scribe in clinic, and across Texas Oncology, we've had champions that have really championed this. We have 500 providers that are using an AI scribe service to generate notes. That's been really meaningful. And not only in that care delivery efficiency piece, but also in the documentation piece. So when I see a patient, I tend to document an ICD-10 code that correlates to their diagnosis, right? So if it's a left upper outer quadrant breast cancer, that is what I put. But in my note, there's all sorts of other information characterizing their diabetes and their osteoporosis and their obesity and, their hypothyroidism. And I don't take the time to code those things, which is a limitation in how I'm assessed in treating the patient. But who has time to really document all of those other things? But my scribe service does generate all of those other ICD-10 codes that gives better color even for payers and others that touch my patients in understanding really the complexity of their disease and disease management.
That's incredible. I think about that as you're speaking, and the number of times I'll, forget to say, encounter for therapeutic monitoring, right, of the long-term management of something or anticoagulation. Like, these things matter because they can actually have an influence on what is compensated or returned, not even to the physician, but even covered for the patient. Like, oh, was this necessary? Was this unnecessary? And just the thought to be able to say, as I'm saying out loud, you're here to follow up your hospitalization for, God forbid, COVID, pneumonitis or pneumonitis from therapy, like that automatically comes, toxicity grade 3 because they were admitted for pneumonitis. Like, and as I'm saying that out loud, that's pretty much here. It sounds like you're using that already, which is amazing. One other part I would say, even you painted this beautiful picture of the diagnosing the cancer, how well and accurately and hopefully how early we diagnose it, to then our treatment decisions, to making sure we don't miss anything, to also considering variables that could be relevant in the response or toxicities that sometimes it's just hard to keep up with as drugs come out. Even after all of that, including the patient room and the discussions and then getting the consent, is then this whole, laborious process of just getting it approved in insurance companies. And if, you're a patient and listening to this, for those physicians that are deeply invested in the clinical outcome, it hurts us when things are being delayed. And it's always at the mercy of sometimes somebody, the person in your office, the person that may be out. Is it coded correctly? Is it withdrawn correctly? They have a big lift because they don't have a medical degree. All of that is already happening as well. So hopefully be able to get scans quicker and approvals for surgeries quicker and all of these things. So it is a true I'm told, as they say in sales, end-to-end kind of implementation that helps the entire process, from one point to the other.
It's a great point that you bring up, Sanjay, and I think most doctors actually aren't aware of it, but managing the administrative burden of prior authorization delays appropriate care and is financially a big lift for most healthcare organizations. And so being able to contribute to means to do that more efficiently and effectively really matters. So like when I'm starting a patient, like when I was in clinic on Monday, I saw a new stage 3 triple negative breast cancer patient. And I started her on the Keynote 522 regimen, the pembrolizumab with Taxol, carboplatin, adriamycin, and Cytoxan, standard of care. But what I did for her was multi-component, right? Because I had to stage her cancer and talk to her about that, educate her, write for her chemotherapy, and do all of the appropriate workup. So one of the things I did is I tested her thyroid function, right? Because and while that's nothing to do with her cancer, I know I'm going to put her on immunotherapy. I know that a potential toxicity of immunotherapy is I could cause her to have hypothyroidism. And what routinely happens is when doctors write for a thyroid function evaluation in the laboratory, it's a reimbursement hazard because you haven't coded for an appropriate diagnosis to make that appropriate. But because I use an ambient AI listening service, I've explained to the patient, why I'm ordering these different tests, and it's there. So when my team wants to understand what codes are there to better justify the laboratory tests that I've ordered, they have it available. And so it helps manage the prior authorization of those evaluations much better. And then on the back end, the revenue cycle of getting a billing appropriately and making sure you get paid appropriately for the work that you're doing, it manages that too. And, I think many doctors, again, don't appreciate this, but in a lot of our value-based care models, we're compensated appropriately based on the complexity of patients. We will get paid less if our patients look like 93-year-old marathon runners with lung cancer, and if the payer does not have insight into their multiple comorbid illnesses. And so our failure to document that hurts us in terms of that reimbursement. We have to manage all those things, right? But when we don't document it, and who has time, most of us have a huge administrative burden already, that if you're not documenting appropriately reflective of patients' comorbid illness, your reimbursement is less. So you probably are familiar with CMMI's Enhancing Oncology model, which is CMMI's alternative payment model pilot in value-based care for cancer care. So if you have one less hierarchical condition category, which is like one less comorbid illness, on average, it's about $7,000 less of compensation that a practice receives for the care of that patient. And so there are a lot of aligned incentives to try to make sure that your medical documentation is really accurate, not just sufficient to treat the cancer, but is an accurate reflection of the picture of the patient as it possibly can be. So I think AI helps us there because most of us are spending a lot of time jumping through the administrative hurdles, trying to get our patients what they need. And something as easy as ambient AI listening, as a Scribes service that can provide additional documentation for things like ICD-10 codes, can augment your practice in so many other ways, in addition to making it easier.
So talking about that with the ambient listening and the billing codes, I think one thing that we don't talk about enough that I have, fortunately or unfortunately realized really matters. And that's when adoption happens if it makes financial sense, right? It's mostly a for-profit industry, the health industry, I say mostly, very much so. So my thinking now has become, well, how do we make the value prop for what is ultimately better care? So there's this example of ambient listening and getting the reimbursement for what is being done. And then there's also hopefully the aid of getting these scans approved and covered, one, either with ambient listening, or two, with AI, basically structuring or reading where AI can actually, go through with their LLMs and ascertain these things that otherwise a doctor already knows because they wrote it all down and now have to say it again. So there's those two elements. How else do you think that AI, and I know that there's many different ways from toxicities to admissions to clinical decision support, can actually help what we always say and don't really have any solutions for in the overextended and financial burdens that relate to the healthcare system that are truly alarming, that we don't talk about it enough because I guess there's not enough to say as a solution. But I think AI can be that. Are there other ways that you can think of it that could actually help the financial toxicity for either the patient or the healthcare kind of health and economy as a whole?
Thousands, and that are real time ready. So let me just give one example. In cancer care, I'll set the stage first. In cancer care, we deliver about 30% of our therapeutic interventions through oral oncolytics, through pills, right, that control cancer. And they're not like aspirin or Advil, right? Like they're pills that frequently have toxicities that require management. As I'm a breast cancer specialist, I give a lot of CDK4/6 inhibitors, so palbociclib, abemaciclib, ribociclib. And about 40% of the time, we end up dose reducing them on a patient's journey to allow them to continue to have benefit from that drug, but an acceptable toxicity profile. So monitoring that therapeutic intervention is really, really critical, right? But what happens if you don't have real-time monitoring is patients can have toxicity that leads them to prematurely discontinue their medication or have an adverse outcome like an ER visit or a hospitalization, right? So patients becoming educated, right, reducing that asymmetry of information that exists from what I know about those medications and what my patient knows, becomes really critical. And it's a problem that patients have this deer in the headlights effect often when they're in my office and may not leave with 100% of what I say. They may only leave with 10% of what I say. How do we do better? Well, I think there's a real secret sauce, Sanjay, in this education that we provide to patients. So how might you do that? Well, I think we're all familiar with chatbots, right? And the information that you can get from a chatbot service. I would say that is, I think, an early phase of AI integrating to serve customer needs. But imagine you have that sophisticated to a co-pilot. Okay, that's sort of next-gen chatbot, right? As a co-pilot functionality where you're educated by content that you've pre-approved, whether it's your own organization's content or whether it's other available content from a reputable resource that you trust. So you have a co-pilot where patients can go in and say, Dr. Patt started me on abemaciclib, but I have diarrhea that I can't manage, and what should I do? And it might give them some information that should always include reach out to your clinical team. But also can educate them about, abemaciclib has this toxicity profile and people manage it with these functionalities, right? If you provided that education to patients or patients and their caregivers, it would empower them to have better and faster management of the toxicities that they have. We know that the natural consequence of that is that patients are compliant with their therapies, they're able to benefit from their therapies for a longer duration of time, and they have better outcomes.
I've learned, too, that people, in addition to sometimes not knowing or being aware of the fact that jumping on it quicker helps the shelf life. So it's not just the response that makes the shelf life for a treatment, but also the tolerability. Those are the two factors on how long somebody can have a benefit from therapy. But a third element is, and very, humbling when I first recognized this, is that sometimes patients are afraid to talk about side effects because they know it's working, they had a good scan, and they're like, I don't want to be discontinued. So now, that can also provide that kind of counsel. I'm like, this does not mean that, we got to table it, but actually tell us beforehand so that we can jump on it sooner. I think in addition to those, again, discontinuations and admissions, which are always tough on family, physician, and patient, you had mentioned drug discovery, and it was actually Greg Simon, who's become, I'm humbled to say, a good friend. He was the first director for Cancer Moonshot. He had kind of informed me the reason that the costs are so high, basically, long story short, is because you need to be made whole for how much it costs to even get there, to make that drug, that indication, to discover it, and all of the expense incurred. I imagine that with AI and kind of more targeted, loosely targeted discovery of drugs without the necessarily financial and physical labor of some of the processes we had before will hopefully reduce the cost of actually finding, identifying, and potentially one day testing it in these kind of like organoid or, biologic clones, so to speak, when they're validated, to hopefully significantly reduce how much it costs to get there. Do you think that's, possible? And could that be a real save for this very, expensive pharmaceutical industry?
So it's a great point that you bring up, Sanjay, and I think that the drug discovery piece is really exciting. I know that you and I both attended the Google Cloud AI and Cancer Care meeting just a few weeks ago in Boston, really exciting, and learned about some of the great work that they're doing with AlphaFold out of Google DeepMind to really think about engineering some of that drug development prior to any beginning of clinical trials, so you can really engineer these drugs to the druggable target right away. I talk all the time about how we've become much more elegant in cancer care, and we've had effective cancer therapies for a long time, but many of the therapies that we provide, like chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation, are sort of like axes to the door. They're rough and less elegant ways to get the door open to let someone go through their journey of life unabated by cancer. But now that we have an understanding of the molecular mechanisms of disease, and we understand that for so many cancers, they're driven by these molecular characteristics, we really have the ability to open that door with a lock and key. And so if we can find that lock, right, if we can identify that molecular mechanism and develop a key for it, then we are able to have a more elegant and toxicity-limited journey for cancer patients. And I think that's the dream, right? I say all the time, and you and I have talked about it, Sanjay, I want patients to live where cancer doesn't take their life and cancer therapy doesn't take their livelihood. And this is the dream of modern cancer therapy. So this elegant solution, now that we understand the molecular mechanism, we see those locks, we characterize those locks, we're able to make the keys. We're able to make the keys in a much more elegant, predictable way because of AI's way that we can design drugs. So I think that's really exciting, and there's a lot of work there. But in addition to sort of making the drugs, so putting more in the pipeline that will take the trajectory of drug discovery from this to this, I think that we're able to design clinical trials in a much more elegant way, so we're not wasting time. Because if we need to trim the fat in all that we do in medicine, and there is a lot of waste in the clinical trial system today. So being able to say, okay, if I modify my toxicity criteria to a lymphocyte count of this or a white blood cell count of this, how might that impact my results given the information that I know from early phase trials, so I can power a phase 2, phase 3 trial to make sure that I can get the result I need without wasting additional resources. That's what everyone wants. And I think that the financial argument is a real one because we spend $4.5 trillion on healthcare in this country every year. So the financial argument is an important one. We, as you've heard me say, we have to be responsible stewards of the healthcare dollar, but also these are patients that have to go through this. These are patients' lives that we have to use as we go through clinical trials, and hopefully that helps them. But sometimes it doesn't. And if we could make it help them more, that would be better. I think of the analogy, and I'm going to date myself here. So, you have to forget all of this later. But when I learned to drive when I was 16, there were paper maps involved, and I frequently got lost. So I will say I didn't navigate well, and it was messy. Today, I cannot imagine traveling to any unknown destination without Google Maps brought up on my phone, guiding and directing every turn, enabled by Waze to tell me where traffic patterns might obstruct my travel with additional solutions, right? AI technology that I don't even see, right? I don't even necessarily know is there, that's empowering my journey to make me more efficient and effective and to make it just easier to navigate. This is what we want for doctors and patients in healthcare. And I think the challenge that we have before us is we have to heighten awareness for this journey among healthcare organizations, because as we are on this path to nirvana, which we'll never get to, right? Because nirvana is always moving. But as we're on this journey to nirvana, we need to think carefully about the investments in the digital healthcare systems that we make to make sure that we're taking the right steps to walk and then run and then fly towards better, more efficient, and effective care delivery.
If you don't know, ASCO has always been like, the pillar in cancer as far as guidance, responsible, discovery and literature and evidence and what to do and how to do it. Being on the board, being the chair of the Artificial Intelligence Task Force, I'm curious in the manner that you just said it on how, to do it, what cautions to use, but know that it, gets us in the right direction. What are ASCO's feelings about artificial intelligence and possibly, there's this buzzword disruption that everyone says now, but like in a way kind of disrupting the way that we're very classically used to doing things? Is there excitement that's guarded? Is it more concern with a little bit of hope, excitement? Kind of maybe walk us through the best you can, of course, with the disclaimer that this is your, perception of the feelings.
Yeah, all opinions are my own for sure. But I will say I think there's a lot of excitement about it. I think that everyone really sees the potential of the ways that it can help. And I think that, you're right that there are appropriate cautions, and I will say as a result of some of our work on the AI task force, ASCO published some guidelines around responsible use of artificial intelligence in cancer care. And I think that they're very strong. But, things like to be transparent about the use of AI, about what's involved in the models, to have doctors remaining at the center of care delivery, to be knowledgeable about the hallucinations that can exist with things like large language models, with biases that might exist, so you can be cognizant of those things and navigate them appropriately. It makes me think of something I tell patients a lot as I try to prognosticate for them what their future might look like and predict their response to therapy. As I say, we use a lot of models to help us, but all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this is a famous quotation by a famous statistician, George Box, who's really a thought leader in the statistics space. And I think this is so true and so applicable today as we're using large language models to really change a lot of how we disrupt cancer medicine and medicine more broadly, is that not every step that we take, not every recommendation that we give is going to be the right thing. But that's true about everything, right? That's true about every guideline. I mean, I'll give an example. So as a breast cancer specialist, I prescribe a lot of Taxol. Taxol is a really great drug for breast cancer. But Taxol has the side effect of peripheral neuropathy. And if you take a lot of it, it can cause peripheral neuropathy that can be debilitating. So Taxol is a standard of care for many adjuvant therapies in breast cancer. However, if I have a patient that is really dependent upon the fine motor function of their fingers, that may not be the best choice for them. It's a very personalized decision. So if I use a language model to give me a clinical decision support in how I think about the therapy for a particular patient, it may not take that into account, right? I still need a doctor and a patient at the center of care making decisions ultimately about care delivery. But that doesn't mean that I don't benefit from the nudge or the suggestion of the populated decision tree of care delivery, and for a large language model or clinical decision support, or a nudge, if you will, to guide and direct me about what would be a responsible choice for my patient. It's then my job as her doctor to really say, okay, I understand that your livelihood is that you're a tile mosaic artist, and this is what you do. And if I make you lose that ability, I'm dramatically going to impact the quality of your life. So let's take what we've learned from this model and then think about how we use this for you, recognizing its limitations.
I've said something similar, not nearly as eloquently like everything you've said so far, but to the example of AI doesn't know what it doesn't know. And that's where, a physician really makes a difference, to the same point of knowing to ask what somebody likes to do. Sometimes I have to pry, like, so what do you like to do? Oh, I like to see friends, but what do you do? What's your hobby? We get into it and they realize, they think it's maybe small talk, and most of the time it is, but it's large talk to me because it builds a relationship. But that stuff kind of really helps me appreciate their lifestyle. I'll even ping, a myeloma patient that's, getting weekly therapy like all the time. I'm like, yo, you haven't asked me to push one of these, treatments back a week in like 7 months. What's up? Like, are you just not traveling for this, that, and the other? And they're like, yeah, I mean, I just thought, I'm like, look, we're unfortunately stage 4. We have great remission. The response is, usually much, longer in myeloma today than it used to be. I need you to tell me if there's anything you want to do. Well, I've always want to go on this cruise and they're going to Alaska. And I'm like, and you wouldn't have told me that, right? So like, but that's the physician kind of aspect of also being a human, where that human element and consideration is married with the understanding of what that response is, what myeloma therapy does, when interruptions can occur. And I think we get to be more human, basically. If we can have more of the medical algorithmic stuff, we get to use more of the human elements in medicine, which I think no matter what side of the line you are on, we could all agree is something that both patients, caretakers, and physicians and healthcare professionals would love to see.
I would also call out that it's not just about the human aspect of things and, having the doctor be central, but as we adopt these systems, which I think we should, we need to just be really clear about what they're prioritizing. And let me give you an example. So let's say, we all want our clinic to run perfectly, right? We want patients to come in right when they need to. We want to see them in their time and get them on their way so people aren't having to wait, so we're efficient in clinic. So when there's no-shows, it's problematic, right? So there's some software that exists that when patients cancel or no-show, it can deprioritize their ability to create next visits, right? And you could think, oh, that makes sense, right? Because if a patient's going to chronically no-show, we all have a couple patients that do that. They chronically no-show for all kinds of reasons. But maybe they no-show because they have transportation insecurity, or because they are a single parent with a job that does not give them time off to come into the doctor. The solution that we've implemented to make our clinic more efficient could make treatment more difficult for more vulnerable patient populations. And so we just need to be really aware of some of those biases, because I would say most people and systems are biased inadvertently, right? Like, we don't intend to do that. I think we're all aware of hearing people in our lives that we are certain hold biases that don't believe that they do. And the same is true of algorithms, right? And so large language models will have biases inherent to the data that creates them that can influence how they're useful to patients. And that's a risk. And so it's not a reason not to use something, but it's important that we understand it so that way we can help to buffer it and get patients what they need.
And then I've never really considered that element in the inherent bias or unintentional bias component. And it really, is a different podcast, but it makes me think, what does medical school look like, in its education pathway? Like, because if it's not introducing these things and mostly algorithms, we might need a big change. And some people say, oh, dependency is a problem. But I'm like, to your map analogy, people seem to be okay with not knowing what north, south, east, or west means. And, arguably that's been one of the most, timeless 1,000 years. And, we're in the South, so we speak in direction, but like, people just don't even know. And what dependency, is okay if it permits X, Y, or Z. And in healthcare, I think time and education, all that stuff, that's how I address that. But to all of that, and maybe the last point, which is going to be kind of a mixed bag, where do patients sit on the conversation with data, not just as it relates to HIPAA necessarily, but one, some places will be monetizing on data. There's two types, right? There's de-identified, and then there's not de-identified, meaning like you can identify, and that's usually an internal thing. And where does, with your policy experience, how much involvement should there be on a non-medical aspect of what people are doing with their objective things? As an AI enthusiast, I share all mine for everything. I'm like, yeah, if my REM cycles help your analysis on when people are in trouble, depending on the stage of REM physiologically, do it, But especially when it comes to revenue, I wonder if, is it just another means for profit for the healthcare system? Not as the primary purpose. Primary purpose is to get insights and learn and see things.
It's complicated. I will say, patients' data is patients' data, right? And so certainly they should have access to it and to share it as they can. But an individual patient's data seldom is worth a lot on their own, right? And I don't just mean financially. I mean like the value of understanding that. Really, what we want to do is aggregate patient information for greater learning. So we can do things like augment what we've learned from clinical trials with real-world evidence. I mean, I think a great example of that is like when palbociclib was approved in the treatment of metastatic breast cancer. It was approved for women with metastatic breast cancer. Nobody was going to be able to accrue to a trial of men with metastatic breast cancer. Does this mean that men never get palbociclib? And so the Flatiron Group took information from their database to look at real-world evidence of men with metastatic breast cancer that were treated with palbociclib that then later ultimately led to an FDA approval. And we're seeing this more and more, right? The European FDA, if you will, and the FDA's better understanding how to use real-world evidence for this space. So we are able, if we are able to aggregate data, then it can be more meaningful to patients, to the healthcare ecosystem. There's some financial reward for that too, though I would say pretty limited, but there's some financial reward. So it's the data aggregation that becomes so powerful and meaningful, but that is complicated because it requires a lot of organizational investment in data architecture, in doing things like mapping and making sure that you clean the data, because most of that kind of real-world data is augmented with data from, say, the electronic health record. Well, the electronic health record is predominantly a billing system, right? And so when data is entered into the electronic health record, even in structured data elements, that may not translate into the true north. It's always going to introduce some biases. And I'll give you an example. So on Monday of this week, I met my patient with a stage 3 breast cancer, and I staged her breast cancer that, clinically, she has a T3N1 breast cancer by my clinical exam and by the availability of imaging that I had. So I put that all on my health record when I saw her, as I wrote for her Keynote 522 chemotherapy. But then I ordered an imaging for her to understand if she had any evidence of metastatic disease, because that would be the standard of care. So what if next Monday when she comes back and sees me, I see that she has disease in her lungs or liver, and then she has a stage 4 breast cancer? Well, if someone had aggregated that data based on the best information I had at that moment, it's no longer accurate, right? Because she actually has a stage 4 breast cancer. And so the clinical record is imperfect because it changes over time. I mean, clinical stage changes to pathologic stage. We get informed by other information in the treatment journey that causes that to change. And we don't always change that in real time in the health record for a lot of reasons, right? And so we need to evolve for the health record to be easier for doctors to use. Never met a doctor that loves their health record because, who does? But so we need to change. And I think that this is a key point, Sanjay, as we think about AI systems and digital tools more broadly. We cannot expect that it's an unrealistic expectation to think that they are going to meet us where we are and support us perfectly. I think that, like all relationships, it's going to be a collaboration. And the AI systems and digital healthcare is going to improve where we are, but we have to change too in order to optimize what that collaboration is going to look like. And so what that means is we need to think about documentation differently. We need to update it differently. It needs to no longer just be a billing system, but we need to have the expectation that it's going to do things differently. We're going through a change right now in my practice in our communication architecture. And it's sort of a centralized system on how the phones are answered, with the goal of getting patients into the office faster and have their questions answered more quickly. And that's really important. And that's really important work. So I'm so happy about it. But we need to change too, right? So doctors need to be available in different ways in order to manage the other side of that. And those are the growing pains that we're really seeing as we shift systems to a more modern communication architecture, is that we clinicians and our staff need to change as well. And we're not really accustomed to that. I have a managerial role in my practice over some of our regions. And what I'll tell you, if you don't already know, among most professionals, doctors and lawyers for sure, is nobody really feels like they have a boss, right? They really feel like they're their own boss. And in many ways, that's true. But it's hard to get people to change appropriately to adopt these systems. And this is really going to be important as organizations try to implement AI and digital healthcare tools. And as they sort of populate this journey to nirvana, is that they need to know how to guide and direct their people to change, to meet these technologies where they are, to optimize their results. And the natural consequence of not doing that is they're going to lose a lot of money and make a lot of people unhappy.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that, that axiom of just, if you look at what the lift is in a day or a week and, how annoying something is to have to fix, learn, or change, it's not worth it. But if you look at the 3 month and the 3 year difference, to just, get used to it and familiarize yourself pays dividends later, much like flip phones to iPhones. I mean, there was a time where you just resisted because it was a headache. It was intimidating to understand how a touchscreen works. But obviously, it's paid off. And when you're in an overextended, healthcare system, where I think the recent poll showed 48% of doctors, doctors across the board, all specialties, report burnout, during their year's process. Even that little lift, which seems, small, can be major for someone that's already burned out. This has been an excellent conversation. I'd say one more thing, and this kind of blew my mind, because when we're talking about data and sharing, I've always kind of given this impression, and this is my personal, it's when you share your data, especially de-identified, you're helping, hopefully, humankind, because it's the observations of what's happening, at least as it relates to cancer, what happened, what didn't happen, what were the variables. It's with that we can kind of, collectively better understand the emperor of all maladies, to use Sid's title. He was on the podcast very early on. But then I was like, don't worry about it. If it's de-identified, what's it matter? Then I learned that there are degrees of de-identification. There's good, polished, clean, trustable. And then there's you don't know that it was de-identified, even if it was said to be de-identified. Same thing with somebody coming and saying, we clean your data, we organize your data, we structure it. Now you're going to have different degrees of going to an auto shop or getting a plumber that's way cheaper, and you think it's just cheaper, but then you find out, or the HVAC system, they use electric tape and all this stuff. It's just, like anything in life, you learn that there are degrees of it. Is there anything current or coming that can then actually measure in a qualitative way what, how well it organizes or cleans, or how well or solid or sound the de-identification process is? Or is it just kind of a trial by fire, learn retrospectively kind of thing?
I think there are ways to look at it. One of the ways that we use in health services research is to try to look at inter-rater variability, to try to understand, if you have one person who's sort of cleaning the data, if they're cleaning the data, in the same way, to try to understand if you're providing consistency. And consistency, we're all looking for the true north, right? So consistency, it means consistent. It doesn't always mean the true north, but I think that's one. There are many important ways that I think have been established to try to make sure that you have reproducible and better real world evidence. But that's been an evolution. Again, sort of people need to change. But if I can go back for just a minute to the idea of us changing and the benefits that you can have. I mentioned that my organization is struggling with this communication architecture shift right now, which is really important. But there's a promise. There's a light at the end of the tunnel there on this journey to nirvana. So for years, we've had a bunch of nurses that work remotely to help with triage for the purpose of having faster response times to patients who are calling in with symptoms for symptom management. And for the last 4 years, we've implemented electronic patient-reported outcomes in patients that are on active cancer therapy. And by doing that, our average response time to patients that are calling in or digitally letting us know that they have symptoms is 40 minutes. And we've been able to study and evaluate and publish that we were able to do things like reduce ER visits, reduce hospitalizations, reduce the total cost of care when we implemented the system. And so that sounds awesome, right? It's better care delivery, and it is. I'm really proud of that work. I think that, it's the work of many, but I think that that's really important in care delivery. But now that we're shifting to this universal communication architecture across my statewide practice, we have the ability to grow those nurses to answering first call from 5 to 7 p.m. And you know what that does, Sanjay? It allows my doctors to go home for dinner and to see their kids play soccer and to go to their plays or whatever. It allows, this centralization of communication architecture sets the stage, and it's been a little painful. We have to change, but it sets the stage for a more efficient and effective healthcare ecosystem that gets patients what they need faster, that allows symptoms to be controlled and reduce ER visits, hospitalizations, total cost of care, and ends up being better for healthcare professionals because it decreases the burden of call in terms of the many sacrifices that we make in our own lives.
What a fantastic way to conclude a real world, example of kind of, the direction we're headed in. Well, thank you so much, Debra. It's been an absolute honor, and we look forward to hearing more from you in all of your different avenues and hats.
Thank you, and this was a lot of fun, and I look forward to going down this journey together, Sanjay. I think that this is going to be a mutually beneficial partnership, and what I hope first and foremost, as I know you do, is that this information getting out there can help organizations really understand what they need to do in order to make the necessary changes they need to help patients and help their clinical staff.
Yeah, that's why we created TensorBlack, is to help people guide, people that are doing it in the real world like you with established Texas oncology. So, stay tuned. We'll see what we hit in the future.
Awesome.